Thank you, everyone, for being here, and thank you to the organizers. I particularly appreciate the aspirational name, publisher Flourish, having gotten my first royalty statement on my previous book, $40. I was trying to think about what I wanted to tell you about this book, and it really exists in the shadow of the previous one and the nature of game studies themselves, in that we know a great deal about, over the past 10 years, how the video game industry looks from the 10,000-foot view. We have a lot of macroeconomic understanding of what the industry looks like, but very little understanding of what actually happens within it. When I initially started to study video games, it was because they serve as an excellent example, what a couple of researchers call the ideal commodity for a new form of labor and a new form of industrialization. They are a great example of information labor and a great example of information products. They're also a great example of creative labor. One of the sort of big myths we talk about with the games industry is that it's a high-paying, highly creative industry. It's got a ton of people who want to go into it. What we knew in studying it was that was very true. People wanted to go into it. They got paid fairly well for entry-level jobs, but they didn't tend to stick around. The games industry was dominated and continues to be dominated largely by mid-20s white men, and this plays out in all sorts of ways. Beyond that, we didn't know a whole lot about what happened within the industry, except in moments where particular ruptures occurred. So when the spouse of somebody working in the games industry would finally complain about the notion of crunch time. Crunch time is the idea that at the end of game production, because most video games need to be released right around Christmas, if the game isn't close to done, you simply have to work more and harder. And it was not unusual in the games industry for people to work 60, 70, 80-hour work weeks. That works really well if you're a 20-something white male. It works very poorly if you have a family. If you are a member of the family and your spouse is working in the games industry. And this causes a lot of tension. Writing the previous book and writing my dissertation on it, one of the big challenges for me was that because of the nature of games employment, because it tends to be seasonal, so you sign up for a job and you work for a year, and when that contract is done, you go out and seek a new contract. Nobody wanted to talk. So the sort of great weakness of those previous two works, the dissertation and this previous book, was that I had a lot of information about how the games industry worked, what the practices and processes were, but nobody's actual story. One of the things that happened with this book is I was fortunate enough to get a couple of interesting co-authors, and the process of writing it to me actually is as interesting as anything that happens in it. In trying to write the book, I got together with a rhetorician, with somebody who studies games, and with somebody who works in the games industry, and he essentially served as our entry point to try and convince people to talk with us. And the way in which we wrote the book was that we would begin by trying to identify people who we thought would be of interest from across the spectrum of game design. So in trying to think about what I might read to, it became really difficult because each one is an individual story about an individual career path. What we would do is we would begin with a set of interview questions online where we'd ask them all the same sets of questions, and then the four of us would sit back and we'd have a phone call and talk about what was interesting to us, what we wondered. And then we would call these people up and talk for an hour or 2 hours or 3 hours or as long as they could spare and as long as we had questions and see what came up. I mean, this was a really interesting process because that's almost the antithesis of the way in which my previous book went. There was so much more of my voice in that one. This one, you should have no sense of who I am or who any of the other authors are because we pulled ourselves out of it. What I think is really impressive about this is that the book itself and some of the interviews came out at the same time as some of the major questions in the games industry. So the Gamergate scandal a couple years ago, which continues to percolate a little bit below the surface. We also were able to look at and talk with people from around the world, so to discover the way in which fostering creative industries has failed or succeeded. The Australian industry is a really interesting example of this. And to discover things we'd never ever occurred to us to wonder about, so the nature of what it means to try and license a Disney musical product for a video game, and how difficult that becomes, the negotiations that go into it. So where I think I want to conclude is just to try and think about what it is we can learn from video games when we talk about other industries. And for me, one of the things as a political economist that I found myself thinking about is the way in which video game labor looks a lot like certain aspects of academic labor. looks very similar to certain aspects of film labor, that it borrows from these things. And that one of the sort of undercurrents that we heard from a number of the people we talked about was because the games industry draws heavily on the high-tech industries, which tend to be fairly strongly against the notion of unionization, of collective action. What we started to hear was people in the industry starting to think about that the nature of the work and the employment was something they were grappling with. For some of them, it meant they were going to leave. For some of them, it meant they had to change the nature of the industry itself. And that, I think, was the really sort of fascinating ending. Thank you very much.